follow. I'm going to be speaking today about the border in hearts and minds, and I'm coming at that from the perspective of someone in the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, who has been very involved in seeing the implementation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement fully adhered to and protecting a lot to do with identity and citizenship rights. So when one thinks of a border, you might imagine a physical crossing from one jurisdiction to the next, but in Ireland, there does exist a different kind of border. It's not one that you can see with your eyes or find on a map, but it's one that lives in the hearts and minds of the people of this island, north and south. Ireland was, at a time, a sovereign nation. The War of Independence led to the geopolitical breakup of Ireland. Northern Ireland was created when the island was partitioned by the Government of Ireland Act in 1921, seeing 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland gain independence, leaving the remaining 6 to British rule. The north encompasses roughly 17% of the landmass and around 29% of Ireland's total inhabitants, and it is my home. Since partition, the region has been dominated by political discourse over its constitutional future. Questions regarding citizenship and identity have continued to serve as a particular point of contention since its inception. If one were to consider the historical context, it can be of little surprise that the formation of a state which divided the island, placing 2 rivaling communities into one shared space, resulted in decades of division, segregation, and sectarianism. After decades of conflict, a historical political agreement was reached, and it was and remains a compromise. As with most compromises, they're often hard won, and not without sacrifice. Any person or entity who is a party to an agreement, be it social or political, rarely sees their wishes met to the full extent of their liking, and certainly not without conceding to terms which benefit the other party or parties involved. Such was the case with the Good Friday Agreement. It took the extraordinary vision, determination, and willpower of a generation of peacemakers to bring the people of Northern Ireland and their representatives to an agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was the culmination of years of extensive negotiations, which required the intervention of the Irish, British, and American governments in order to convince the vast majority of regional political parties to make a profound leap of faith. The agreement was ultimately put to a referendum on May 22, 1998, where over 71% of voters in Northern Ireland voted in favour. A simultaneous referendum held in the Republic of Ireland prompted an even larger majority of voters at 94% in favour. To this day, striking an agreement between the 2 main communities of Northern Ireland and bringing an end to 30 years of violence and bloodshed is seen as a shining beacon of peace, reverence, and cooperation, an example which many countries and communities look to as inspiration and aspiration alike. The peace process was, of course, the result of the efforts of numerous dedicated individuals, but much of its success can be attributed to the tireless work of a select few. One of these singular leaders is the now legendary John Hume, Ireland's peacemaker, a giant of a man who, with all his being, believed in peace and reconciliation at a time when such ideas seemed fantastical to some, unimaginable to others, and virtually impossible to most. He would not be dissuaded nor distracted from his path, and through his resilience and vision, a lasting pacification was forged. He was our arbitrator and gave hope to an entire generation that peace was more than a dream. It was achievable, and it was ours if only we reached through the gloom and grasped it. John's message was clear. There had to be an agreement. All conflict is about difference, he said. The answer to difference is to respect it. Therein lies a most fundamental principle of peace, respect for diversity. He would relay this message to anyone who would listen through his single transferable speech as it became known. He repeated the same words time and again, his pleas for peace, reconciliation, and respect, until the message cut through. He convinced not only the people, but the world that peace was possible in even the least likely of places. Without John Hume as one of the Good Friday Agreement's principal architects and visionaries, there would likely have been no agreement at all. However, Equally, without the persistent efforts of Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, Prime Minister Tony Blair, US President Bill Clinton, Seamus Mallon, David Trimble, Mitchell McLaughlin, George Mitchell, and Mo Mullen, a consensus like the likes of the Good Friday Agreement undoubtedly would not have been possible. There was something serendipitous at play when peace finally befell this region. The Good Friday Agreement was a mighty and momentous achievement and will continue to serve both the people of this island and as a legacy to the architects who imagined it. Despite the magnitude of the agreement, ushering into place a treaty of bonding and compromise was merely a cornerstone, a foundation upon which change could, over time, be formed and enacted. Born out of the Good Friday Agreement was a peace accord founded on the principles of equality and mutual respect, with an onus on the co-guarantors of Britain and Ireland to protect and enshrine these fundamentals into domestic policy and practice. A complex and nuanced combination of legislation, reform, and goodwill has historically always served as essential catalysts for the creation of effective, newly formed institutions, with many modern examples having flourished under the protective blanket of EU law. As a co-guarantor of the agreement, the British government was required, under its international obligations, to give domestic legal effect to all relevant provisions of the Good Friday Agreement and to implement into legislation the principles and rights which the signed commitments afforded to its people. Within a year of the Good Friday Agreement's finalisation, the Irish government had augmented its laws to reflect these new rights. In its language, the Good Friday Agreement affords the people of Northern Ireland the explicit right to decide their own identity, be it Irish or British or both, with each respective government agreeing to accept that free choice. Identity in Northern Ireland cuts across religion, political expression, and nationality, and it's here where the border in hearts and minds lives. The Good Friday Agreement sought to remove identity as a point of conflict, so as to allow hardened identities, hardened people, to soften their opposition to each other. With this provision of the Good Friday Agreement, bolstered by the now once joint membership of Ireland and Britain in the EU, it no longer mattered if you were Irish or British. I was 11 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and I couldn't have imagined then that I would become part of its implementation. I took forward a legal case with my husband, Jake DeSouza, a case that uncovered a failure of the British government to give domestic legal effect to this integral provision, the right to be accepted as Irish or British or both. And as a result, the people of Northern Ireland were denied their birthright to be accepted as Irish under UK law, without conceding first to unjust rules and restrictions implemented by the British government. Irish-only citizens were being forced to first legally accept that they were British, incriminating themselves by inaccurately declaring themselves as British on official government documentation, and paying the government a sizable fee for the privilege of having their own rights accepted to no longer be considered British. This abusive and discriminatory policy was what ultimately prompted both me and my husband to take the British government to court, highlighting numerous unjust policies and prejudicial practices which were, in our eyes, inarguably and entirely against the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. When we set out to begin our lives together in 2015, it wasn't with the intention or thought that we would be challenged as a state body. We had inadvertently joined the lengthy procession of ordinary people caught up in an extraordinary situation. The outcome of our case affected the question of identity and citizenship of the entire population of Northern Ireland, but in particular those who identified as Irish. A fundamental part of the success that we would eventually have was a result of launching a highly visible campaign. We had to expose ourselves in order to highlight the issue. And I can recall clearly my first ever live radio interview. This marked the beginning stages of my private life becoming public, seeing myself relieved of comfortable obscurity in much the same manner as so many others who'd taken stands on controversial topics. I didn't have the understanding, knowledge, and experience that I've since gleaned. All I had that day was a cursory understanding of the law and the feeling that there was something so unjust, so inherently wrong with the situation I find myself in. During this first interview, I was crowned Principal Holder of the Year by the presenter. It was a soft introduction to a phenomenon of belittling and oftentimes far less ambiguous dissension that I would become all too familiar with as time went on. Why not make things easier for yourself? He posited. It was a question I'd already been asked on numerous occasions. But every individual has their own limit as to the threshold of personal beliefs and convictions they're willing to sacrifice in order for ease or placation. To many, holding true to one's principles is a mark of admirable conviction and integrity. But as with most things in life, perception is subjective. Many government bodies and states use their boundless resources as a means to de-incentivize individuals who would seek to bring about reform, convincing them through a unique display of bureaucratic intimidation that the individual does not possess the power to challenge such an entity. These bodies often purposely make the simplest of procedures as complex and needlessly difficult as possible, ever prompting that same mantra in one's mind: why not make things easier for yourself? And that's how they win. No one person is capable of matching the resources and decades, sometimes centuries of experience which government bodies can possess, enabling them to manipulate the systems in place to support their own agenda. But in some cases, the individual facing down a titan of rogue bureaucracy doesn't need comparable resources or experience. It will always be an immense challenge, but not an insurmountable one. And as history tells us, it's also a necessary proponent of a functioning democracy. There's a famous yet mysterious quote, often but erroneously attributed to Gandhi. First they ignore us, then they mock us, then they fight us, then we win. Whilst the exact origin of the quote remains unknown, it stands as a powerful political statement and an apt descriptor of the lesser-known machinations of political activism. When my husband and I began our court case, we were entirely unfamiliar with the sentiment, let alone the uncanniness with which it would come to mirror our own experiences. I was, at a time, ridiculed for being a difficult woman, seeking to fix a non-problem. Until poetically, the same principles which drew ridicule and dismissal eventually saw us challenge the state and win. Sometimes being Principal Holder of the Year does have its benefits. In the years since that first live interview, I've become even more accustomed to discourse, debate, and the often duplicitous tactics of the oligarchy. However, I sometimes look back to the person I was on that day with wistfulness, naive yet determined. I wasn't yet politically active at that time, and yet almost overnight, I felt myself shed my former apathy in place of a fervent pursuit of political activism. I find myself reflecting on my own childhood as I delve deeper into the divisions of the past on this island. I was raised in an apolitical household, the product of a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, identifying as Irish and British respectively. Despite my parents' religious or national identities, they neither practiced nor indoctrinated their children into the political dogmas which plagued their own upbringings. I remained sheltered from many of the traumatic and dangerous elements of Northern Ireland culture at that time, and I had little insight into the turmoil which surrounded myself and engulfed my community. However, there were, of course, times in my life where the sectarianism and division which had divided this region bled through into my own experiences. And as a child, I knew that there were safe places and not safe places, and that was normally dictated by the religious upbringing that you had. But for the most part, my parents took great care in keeping us grounded in such unstable times. I believe that the Good Friday Agreement was a starting point, the beginning, not the end, of a process of reconciliation. But true reconciliation doesn't come from words on a page. It comes from within the hearts and minds of people. In the words of John Hume, the solution will be found not on the basis of victory for either, but on the basis of agreement and a partnership between both. The real division of Ireland is not a line drawn on the map, but in the minds and hearts of its people. There remains many barriers to reconciliation, both between Irish and British citizens in Northern Ireland, but also between those of us in the north and those in the south. To fully understand Northern Ireland's unique political landscape, it's crucial to take into account both the economic and health inequalities which critically and persistently impact the region. Over the decades, the poorest areas of Northern Ireland were often at the front lines of the Troubles, where they bore the brunt of the political violence coalescing in a long-standing legacy steeped in deprivation. 20 years on, progress has been made, yet little has changed for the regions affected. It can feel as though we take one step forward and simultaneously take one step back, trapping the people in a seemingly perpetual cycle of stagnation and division. The expansion of integrated education, part of the Good Friday Agreement, is almost at a standstill. Segregation in housing remains a significant issue, and we still don't have a Bill of Rights to embed the principles of equality and mutual respect, all of which maintains a cycle of dividing and sorting citizens by religious denomination or political leaning. Segregated education continues to dominate the school systems in the north, in tandem, it seems, with segregated history. Earlier this year, a survey by Parallel Histories revealed a disparity between which period of history is being taught in northern secondary schools, divided down religious lines. We have, in essence, three different versions of our shared history being taught on the island, two in the north and one in the south. All three are different, facilitating and embedding different narratives. It would seem only logical that such disparity leads to a disconnect between our citizens. Integrated education formed an integral part of the Good Friday Agreement for a reason. In order to break down barriers to reconciliation, we must first break down barriers between each other. The Good Friday Agreement has become my guiding principle, and I've turned to it to protect my right to be accepted as Irish. When facing dissenting views, I turn wholly to this agreement as my blueprint, for outlined within its pages, there can be found no one community held above another, but rather a guide to the construction of equality and the building blocks of mutual respect and parity of esteem. In my view, it now falls to the next generation to see the work of the Good Friday Agreement complete, and much work remains to heal the divisions in this society and to ensure that the future envisioned by John Hume is fully realized. There will be struggles ahead, but we must face them with the spirit of those that came before us. We've been given a gift of peace, but it is also a responsibility. Civil rights movements are, once again, sweeping the world's political discourse. There's a lengthy history of civil rights movements and demonstrations spurred by government inaction, which in turn see newfound resolve to rectify systemic abuses and mistreatments, only to eventually dwindle back into a whisper in the recesses of the minds of most citizens once other pressing issues take the forefront. And it's there then an unavoidable benign complacency, which enables more malevolent forces to allow yet more abuses and injustices to again begin to take root, once more competing and restarting the cycle. The 21st century has seen ordinary people engaged on a whole new level, thanks in part to the advent of social media and with it widespread ease of connectivity and the resulting evolution of a more global sense of standards. People expect more. There could be seen a synchronicity to the recent resurgences of rights movements throughout the globe, as we in turn begin to lose some of our most influential civil rights leaders to age and illness. In 2020 alone, John Hume, John Lewis, and Seamus Mallon all passed within 6 months of one another, at a time when their words, vision, and guidance could again make a continuing difference in the fight against injustice. But in turn, losing important leaders of peace and egalitarianism can pave the way for the next generation to step forward, putting fire under their heels to both see their inspirational work complete and to continue to hold the line in the fight for equality and peace. Through these leaders, though these leaders may have passed on, there's little doubt that the spirit embodied by Hume, Lewis, and Mallon will always persist to influence change and progress. In the end, we were successful with our case, and as a result, all the people of Northern Ireland will be considered EU citizens under immigration law. But there are other considerations when we think about Northern Ireland today, and that's in the context of Brexit. Brexit makes adhering to the parity of esteem principles of the Good Friday Agreement incredibly hard. And despite best efforts to mitigate the negative consequences of Brexit on the island of Ireland, there will be an impact on people's lives, north and south. In Northern Ireland, we have already seen a hardening of identities, where people are now forced to choose between being Irish or British dependent on rights. And that too brings into question the constitutional future of Northern Ireland, which may bring the question of the reunification of Ireland to the polls a little sooner than some may have thought. Thank you.